Okay. Hi, everyone, and thanks for joining today's webinar. The title is Wind Turbine Design and Bats. This is a WREN webinar, and WREN is one of the tasks of the International Energy Agency's Wind Technology Collaboration Program. And just as a short introduction, let's see if I can share my slides here. WREN has recently been accepted for a new task. So we're keeping the same acronym, but changing the title for WREN. It did stand for Working Together to Resolve Environmental Effects of Wind Energy. WREN now stands for Wind Energy Environmental Research and Engagement Network. So we were through IEA Wind. We were originally designated as Task 34 when we started. Back in 2012, we went through 12 years under Task 34, but now with this new proposal, they've designated us now as Task 59. This proposed term lasts for 4 years, so we just started and will end in September 2028. And the reason why the International Energy Agency has continued to support an environmental task is because international collaboration is very important to advance our solutions to wind energy and environmental issues. Wind energy is obviously, there's global deployment. There's countries and regions that have had wind for a long time, new countries that are emerging. And then we also have species, habitats, ecosystem processes that don't understand our geographic jurisdictions and boundaries. And so we need to work together to help support global deployment while also protecting the environment. Going forward over the next 4 years, our new task will continue a lot of the work that we have been doing over the past 12 years. And all of the work that we do is posted on the TETHIS website. The task produces short research briefs, publications, technical reports, webinars, and we have a technology tool if you're interested in some of the new and emerging technologies used to monitor and minimize environmental impacts from wind energy. You can check out the tool. One of the major objectives that we have for this year is to build on a meeting that was held in March of 2023 and called The Grand Challenges Revisited: Wind Energy Research Needs for a Global Energy Transition. The purpose of this meeting was to bring in 5 research areas, researchers and scientists focused on wind turbines, focused on the atmosphere, focused on plant and grid design, social sciences, and environmental sciences, and find ways that we can work together. Each of these 5 research areas developed their own critical issues to address, but also had cross-sectional meetings to learn how we can work across our different research fields and work together. And so this webinar is an example of this. So we have biologists speaking today. We have atmospheric scientists and folks working on turbine controls and engineering, and combining our various expertise to help explore wind turbine designs and how maybe changing the design of the wind turbine can reduce impact to bats. And so with that, I want to announce the 3 speakers that we have for today. We have Julie Garvin, who is an ornithologist and ecologist who has been working in the wind wildlife space since 2008. She currently serves as an eagle and avian subject matter expert on NextEra Energy's wildlife team, where she has worked for the past 3 years. Prior to joining NextEra, Dr. Garvin worked as a senior ecologist and project manager at Tetra Tech, where she coordinated pre-construction and post-construction wildlife studies, conservation plans, and eagle permitting for a myriad of wind facilities across the U.S. Our second speaker is Eliot Quon, a senior researcher at the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, where he has been working since 2014. His research broadly focuses on developing, validating, and applying computational fluid dynamic models to study the multi-scale atmospheric interactions between regional weather and renewable energy facilities. He has been studying wind-wildlife conflict for over 4 years and is focused on bringing together biologists, atmospheric scientists, and wind engineers to address pressing issues surrounding wind energy deployment. And our third speaker is Michael Sinner, a research engineer at NREL. His work focuses on the control of wind turbines and wind farms to improve power capture, mitigate structural loads, and achieve other objectives. Misha is also a lead developer of various open source wind controls related software, including the Flores wind farm flow model. So with that, I am going to pull up Julie's slides, and just give me 1 second, Julie. This. And share my screen again. Does that work? Oh, wait, no. Now did that work?
Yeah, that looks great. Thank you, Chris.
Sure.
And thank you, everyone, for joining this webinar. I'm really excited to talk to you about some of the research that I've been doing and then learn about the other aspects of, this is a really complicated problem space that we're working in. So I think it's so exciting to have insight from people that are looking at all the different dynamics. So my presentation today is going to have a focus on some research that started, I think, back in 2020, before the world changed, and just really emphasize the implications of that research that was focused on bats and how, because we were interested in trying to figure out, as turbine sizes are increasing, what does that impact have on bat mortality? If you could move to the next slide, Chris. So the paper that I'm talking about was published in Biological Conservation earlier this year. My co-authors Juniper Simonis and Jenny Taylor worked really hard over about 4 years to get this published. It was a pretty massive undertaking. So you can it's an open access article. You can scan that QR code, or I've also provided the DOI link. And this covered actually 3 representative species, hoary bat, as well as horned lark and red-tailed hawk, as being sort of 3 representatives of species which are typically found at as fatalities at wind facilities. And we typically sort of group mortality into categories based on how how easy they are to find and how fast they're removed. So we typically have bats, and we have small birds, and we have large birds. So each of those is sort of a nationally distributed species that's commonly found. And so those were our sort of representatives for our analysis. But today I'm just going to focus on the analysis that we did and what we found regarding bat mortality. If you want to, yeah, there we go. So the research started with just sort of this question that's been raised by many different stakeholders, which is, as turbine size changes, really what if any are the relationships with bat mortality? So in order to answer this question, which is certainly, we weren't the first to ask this question, but we find that there are a lot of environmental and other correlates with wildlife mortality at wind facilities. And typically, fatality monitoring studies are done at one facility at a time, right after that project goes to operations. And traditionally, wind facilities would just use one turbine type. And so this made it really difficult to see the effect of any turbine size parameter on mortality, because it would be confounded with annual variation, with aspects of the site, with the habitat. So in order to reduce or try to control for all of these site effects, we did a query of data from wind facilities that had multiple different turbine models. If you want to go ahead and click Chris. So that is what we're referring to as a mosaic wind project. So we sort of just showing that here. So we queried data from the American Wind Wildlife Information Center, their database of post-construction mortality studies, and we focused on those that did monitoring where there was more than one turbine type, so that we could produce a fatality estimate for the species of interest specific to that turbine type at these facilities. So again, this is to isolate the specific turbine parameter and how it might vary between these two. So, and then the effects that we were most interested in examining was the turbine size on the fatality rate itself, but then also on how might the turbine size parameters affect how far carcasses fall from the turbine, because these mortality studies are extrapolating essentially a fatality estimate based on the fatalities that are found. And if the search plots are only so big and there's ballistics data that show bigger turbines might throw carcasses farther, then that changes the picture of what we think we are seeing in terms of the mortality at that site. So it was really important to incorporate the effect of the turbine size on both of those aspects. And that is why we had to actually develop a completely novel analysis method instead of being able to use some of the existing fatality estimation tools that are out there. If you want to move along. So the database had data with multiple turbine sizes, or mosaics, we grouped them in these biological conservation regions here, and some facilities, some of these regions only had one, others, for example, in the Great Lakes region, where there are provincial requirements to do mortality monitoring, had a lot more studies that were available and that met our selection criteria. Some of those criteria included, like, we had to have sort of modern generation turbines. The monitoring study of the multiple turbine sizes had to occur at the same time so that we could control for annual variation. If we developed a mosaic where it was two facilities that were like next door, they had to have a certain distance. They had to be in the same county, for example. So all of these selection criteria, we're just trying to reduce the potential confounding and make sure that if we were interpreting the results for a turbine parameter of mortality in a specific region, that really we were talking apples to apples for that mosaic. So in total, we had 44 projects that met our criteria, and that represented 24 unique mosaics. So some of these had multiple monitoring years or variations of the study. Next slide. And I should mention that even though Hawaii did enter our study, that was not a Hawaiian hoary bat that we used for the analysis, because that is a different species than the hoary bat on the mainland. So I just want to make that clear. So the turbine size parameters that we examined, so there's 5 basic parameters that are typically reported and analyzed. So we've got the power or the nameplate capacity of the turbine itself. And then that's influenced by how big the rotor blades are. So we looked at the rotor diameter. We have the hub height, or how high above ground is the nacelle. And then the ground clearance, which is the difference between the lower end of the turbine swept area and the ground. And then the maximum blade tip height, which is the actual maximum extent that the turbine sweeps the sky. So we wanted to look at, a lot of these variables are correlated. So we looked at a correlation matrix to try to include the most distinct and the least covariate parameters for our analysis. And when we looked at that, next slide, we found that rotor diameter and ground clearance were the least correlated. And although power was somewhat correlated with rotor diameter, which is just sort of a typical, like, that's part of turbine design, is the rotor diameter influences the power. We included power because of the social importance. because we're constantly looking at like how can we generate the energy to meet our needs with the least impacts possible. So, and that was a particular interest to the industry, so we wanted to include that parameter. As you can see in the table here, we are looking at the range of flight heights of the common noctule, which is actually a European bat, but seems like it should be really similar to what we would expect the hoary bat flight heights to be, and its relationship with the space that the turbine rotor blades exist above ground. And so you can see we had focal turbines, so these are the ones that were in the AWIC data set, and then we have the Priors turbines, which are actually publicly available data that we're able to use to establish existing relationships of bat mortality with these Priors turbines, and then we used our Bayesian model framework to examine the relationships of our focal turbines relative to the Priors. And you can see here sort of the variation within the data set of the number of turbines per mosaics, and what the size of the rotor diameters were across our data set, as well as the hub height, ground clearance, etc. And for the power, all of these turbines had a minimum of a 1 megawatt turbine design, with the maximum being a 3.6 megawatt turbine. Next slide. So as I mentioned briefly, we use this integrated modeling approach where we incorporated searcher efficiency and carcass persistence data to generate fatality estimates, as opposed to taking the published fatality estimates from these individual studies. And we had this hierarchical model so that we could look at these different scales. So, region obviously could have an important factor on mortality, the individual mosaic, the individual project, what was the study protocol, what time of year was the monitoring performed, the actual turbine itself, as well as the search plots, because a lot of times you'll have different search plots even within a given site. So we used a hierarchical structure, and that allowed us to incorporate both the random and the fixed effects. And we did this Bayesian paradigm, and that was necessary in order to deal with the confounding of turbine size parameters affecting both the fatalities that we're detecting as well as the fatality rate itself. So, and that's how we generate the fatality rate estimates and the carcass fall distributions from our Priors. And then we were able to empirically examine how do our modeled turbines, sorry, not the modeled one, but the our focal data set, how are we seeing those compared to these ones that the posterior distributions that we get from our Priors data set. Next slide. So ultimately what we found, and the model did a really good job of parameterizing and capturing the variation in the data, even though we had a lot of different survey protocols and very highly variable wind sites that we were looking at across the country. And we found that mortality actually increased with a decrease in ground clearance. So as the blades are getting bigger, but the height is not necessarily increasing at the same time, we find that space between the lower blade tip clearance and the ground is generally decreasing with these larger turbines, and that's we're finding that that's bad news for the bats, and we saw that was actually the primary predictor of bat mortality, hoary bat mortality. And it was interesting that in our study, the power rating, which again, this is not the actual power produced, but rather the rating of the turbine, and the rotor diameter length really were negligible impact on bat mortality. And I provided the effect sizes here so you can really see how big the effect of the ground clearance was. And then important to mention that the mosaic itself and the region where the study and the mosaic had also a strong effect on hoary bat fatality rates, which is not unexpected given the variation in habitat across the country. But you could see the effect of the mosaic and the region were even had a really strong effect, even relative to the effect of ground clearance. Next slide. So this was kind of surprising because in general, hoary bats are thought to be flying mostly and foraging above the treetop height. So if that's the case, why would the ground clearance have any impact at all? But what we're finding is that a lot of studies are seeing that there's a lot more bat use happening uh, below the rotor swept area than what was previously thought. So I've got an image here taken. Wildlife imaging has this really amazing device that can track these bat flight paths. And if Chris would proceed to the next slide, this is actually what they were detecting, but sort of the other image is sort of like, well, this is maybe what we thought was happening, but what we're seeing is actually perhaps there's a lot more bat use going along below the lowest extent of the rotor swept area. And so if you want to go to the next slide. So it's, as we understand more about bat activity, it's possible that this is actually a really important space. And as the turbine blades are encroaching lower, that could have negative implications for bat mortality. Next slide. So as I mentioned also, the fall distance is also being affected by ground clearance. So how far out you have to search in order to capture most of the bat fatalities, regardless of their removal by scavengers, is also being influenced by ground clearance. So we're not quite sure how the causal mechanism here, but as the ground clearance is decreasing, we see that the hoary bats are falling farther away from the turbine, which seems a little bit counterintuitive, but I think the interaction with how bats actually fly around a turbine and sort of the ballistics of when they're hit is just not really well understood. But this is something that's important to take into consideration when you're performing mortality monitoring for bats to make sure that we're capturing that well. And again, like what we saw with the fatality estimate, rotor diameter and power rating didn't really have an effect on the bat distance that it fell. Next slide. So basically, in conclusion, not surprising and consistent with other research, we find that regional and local factors do strongly influence the fatality rates. So what we see at one site is not necessarily going to be predictive of a site somewhere else or at a different point in time. But this effect, the really strong effect that we saw of ground clearance is, basically indicating that, hoary bats perhaps are behaving differently than what we expected, and that's really important for trying to address the risk of turbines. And we know that our fleet is aging, and so a lot of operators are opting to replace the blades with longer turbine blades, but leaving the towers alone, and that would effectively reduce the ground clearance of all of those. And then other talks today are going to talk about trends in where we see these things happening, and where we see the turbine design going. And so that also is going to have implications for ground clearance, and that may also impact the future of hoary bat mortality at wind facilities. And I'm happy to answer any questions after everyone's done speaking.
Thanks so much, Julie. Eliot, when you are ready, ready to share your screen and begin your presentation.
All right. Let's see. How does this look?
Looks good, and we can hear you.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much, Julie, for teeing up my presentation. So yeah, my name is Eliot Quon. I'm a researcher at NREL. So the work that I'll be talking about today was funded by, or is funded by a project that is funded by the DOE that started in 2022. It's called the Holistic Multi-Fidelity Systems Engineering Project. It's led by NREL, but also includes partners at San Diego National Laboratories, as well as from the universities, including Brigham Young University, Purdue, and Stanford University. So this project is focused on applying engineering tools. At a high level, there's no mention of wind wildlife issues, but the focus is really on real world considerations for wind turbine and wind farm design. So this includes environmental co-design. And through this project, we've been able to look in the past at mitigating conflict for raptors. And in the past year and this upcoming year, we'll be looking at the possibility of mitigating wind turbine and bat conflict. So to set the stage, I've plotted some data here from the US wind turbine database. As Julie mentioned, there's a lot of different ways you can define what a bigger turbine really means. Here I've plotted rotor diameter and tower height. So we can see that the rotor diameter has been steadily increasing. If we think about this in terms of the rotor swept area, that's actually diameter squared. So the rotor swept area is actually increasing at a much faster rate. And then we can also see that in recent years, we're no longer in this 80-meter hub height regime. So since the late 2000s, it was kind of standard that most turbines were 80 meters above the ground. Well, the nacelle was 80 meters above the ground, but in recent years, we've seen a growth in the turbine in terms of the rotor height or the nacelle or hub height. And the turbines are getting bigger for good reason from a wind energy development perspective, but these have implications, of course, for wildlife and volant species. The reason this is good for wind is because the wind resource and capacity factor improve with height. So as the rotors get larger, we're able to extract more of the energy from the wind, so we can produce more power more often. And then it's intertwined with the design with this wind resource is the design of the whole turbine system, which includes the tower structure. And the cost of building a taller tower is, towers tend to increase in cost very quickly with height. So the economics tend to minimize the height of the tower as much as possible for a given turbine design. And really, historically, we've only seen taller towers in selected regions where the wind resource is more moderate and not as high as, say, the Great Plains in the U.S. So what is the impact of turbine size on bats? We generally know that there's more bat activity near the ground. Studies have also shown that as we make the turbines taller in terms of hub height, the fatalities or bat mortality in general tends to increase, which makes sense because we're encroaching on a larger part of their aerial habitat. We've also seen that there's some species-specific effects. So depending on the species of interest, the total turbine height could increase or decrease turbine mortality. But as Julie has shown, that there is a clear trend that increasing ground clearance will tend to decrease hoary bat fatality rate. So here I've used the same US wind turbine database data set and plotted ground clearance. Over recent years, the trend has been towards reduced ground clearance, but on a region by region basis, it's not entirely clear whether this is continuing to decrease or in some regions it might be leveling out or increasing. But it is a little bit scary to see that the minimum ground clearance was about 10 meters. So there's a lot of data out there, and it's not all public, but from what I can find, the lowest ground clearance turbine that was installed in the last year had a 12-meter distance between the bottom of the rotor and the ground. So what we've done is, or what I've done is independently verified this mortality trend that Julie has identified using a public data set. So many thanks to Megan Seymour, who I saw on the call earlier. So many thanks to Megan from Fish and Wildlife Service. She was the one that compiled this data set that includes publicly available mortality data. The original data set had 239 different studies, and after applying a series of filters, the analysis that I'm showing here is based on 56 studies. So it's from a statistics perspective, it's not a huge number, but I think we can see that regardless of how we choose to analyze the data, that the downward trend is clear. So I think this is the main takeaway from my talk. If you take away nothing else, is that we can actually come up with actionable information about turbine design and the role of ground clearance and how this should affect the next generation of turbines. So the filters I applied to going from 239 to 56 studies was to make sure that there was no adjustment in cut-in speed, because a lot of these studies were kind of pre and post-construction, or may have included habitat conservation plans. So I've neglected any study that had curtailment. And then there were also corrections that were applied for the length of the study and the area that was searched. And then I only looked at unbiased mortality estimators that had a confidence interval provided. So yeah, some more caveats about this study. So most of the public data that I had in hand came from the Midwest. The studies ranged from about 3 months to up to a year. I only used the WHOSO or GenEst mortality estimate. And again, I didn't actually do this analysis. I just analyzed the data that came out of these analyses that were compiled by Megan. And then the turbines that were searched in each study also varied. And then what I had to do was go into the turbine database and manually adjust the turbine properties to include historical values for projects that were repowered. So if we think about, okay, how can we act on this, or what implications does this have moving forward? What I've done is plotted the ground clearance for turbines that were installed or retrofitted in the last year or so. The most popular turbine in the US right now is the GE 2.8 megawatt, which has a rotor diameter of 127 meters. And there's actually two variants of this with two different hub heights. So there's one model that has a hub height of 114 meters, and the other, a more popular baseline model, has a hub height of 89 meters. So if we go back and look at this figure and look at where ground clearance falls on here, we can conservatively say that if we install the turbine model that has the 50-meter ground clearance, we could potentially decrease bat mortality by nearly 60%. So I think this is important, actionable information, and it means that the technology already exists to help manage this or mitigate this wind wildlife conflict with respect to bats. So then going back to my background and the project that is funding the study, my next step was to apply our in-house engineering tools. So we have a tool called WISDOM, which stands for Wind Plant Integrated Systems Design and Engineering Model. This is open source, publicly available. It's been in steady development for a decade or two. So the first step was to apply the systems engineering tool to look at what happens if we increase ground clearance, with the objective of motivating a smarter turbine design for bats. So what I've done here is simply taken an existing open source turbine model and simply taken the rotor diameter and moved it higher above the ground. I kept the power rating the same and the diameter size the same. So this represents a worst case cost scaling scenario, because there's a lot of room for further improvement here. So if you move the rotor taller, you might as well change the power rating, or you can change the specific power so that you can extract either more power or potentially extract power more often. And then if you're changing the power rating and optimizing the aerodynamics of the rotor, then you might also want to change the components and change your gearbox. And all of this has implications for the actual design of the tower. So this worst case scenarios is based on current tower technology, which uses this CAN design with it's a steel structure. It's limited to current design constraints that are associated with transportability as well as manufacturability. So this is again a worst case scenario. If we were to develop more advanced tower technologies, then this would help drive the cost down. Um, so our ongoing work, just to summarize, we've identified and corroborated the mortality trend and quantified the relationship between bat mortality and ground clearance. Our findings show that we can actually achieve reductions in bat mortality using current technology. Our ongoing work is to consider more data. We have other researchers at NREL that are actually currently doing geospatial analyses, thinking about bat mortality in the US. So the next step is to work with them to inform our systems engineering analyses. With more data, our hope is that we can actually drill down to species-specific analyses. And then from there, our goal this year is to really exercise this wisdom tool to try to drive down the cost as much as possible to build a business case for these taller turbines. And that is my talk. Thank you.
Thanks, Elliot. And then, yeah, Misha, whenever you're ready, please share your screen.
Will do. Let's see if I can get this going. Right, looking okay?
Perfect.
Yeah, so thanks everyone for being here. My name is Misha Sinner. I work also work at NREL and work on wind turbine and wind farm controls. And so I'm going to be talking a little bit today about, we've heard a little bit about sort of physical characteristics of turbines that might help, or design of turbines, the sort of physical parts that might help to reduce bat collisions. But I'm going to talk a little bit about the sort of software, the operating procedures that wind turbines run with. And so that's the control of a wind turbine. And what we might be able to do there to reduce bat collisions. So let me just start with a quick background for those who are less familiar with the idea of controls and controls for wind turbines. Basically, when a wind turbine sees certain inflow conditions, and usually we're interested in certain outputs from wind turbines. So we're interested, of course, in the power being produced, but at least in the controls space and also the wind turbine design space, we're also interested in the structural loading on turbine components and making sure that we can have this wind turbine last, its operational lifetime and without falling apart. So what we have to help us with achieving our output goals is a series of control inputs that we can use to operate the turbine and have it perform in the way we want. So the kind of key ones there for a wind turbine are the blade pitch angle. So that's the angle that each blade is at. The generated torque, which is the electrical load applied to the wind turbine, that sort of extracts energy, but also essentially slows the turbine down. And the yaw position, which is the control that drives the turbine to face into the wind, so that it captures power even as the wind direction varies. So in a kind of control speak, we tend to think of these two series of inputs as controlled inputs. These are the inputs that we can do something about and control actively, and the uncontrolled inputs, which are the inflow conditions. So these look like turbulent winds that are coming into our system and certainly affecting the performance, but we can't control them. But I put a question mark here because in some cases we might be able to control the inflow conditions, at least to a small extent. So for a single wind turbine, we can't really do this. But when we have multiple wind turbines in a wind farm, then we have the ability to affect the wakes of upstream turbines and their position on downstream turbines. And so we can start to think about a little bit controlling to a certain extent the inflow conditions to certain turbines in the farm. This is really where a lot of my research lies, is in this wind farm control paradigm, where we have multiple turbines operating in proximity with one another, and we're trying to achieve objectives for the whole farm. So there's kind of various ways we can think about this. We have individual wind turbine control. So each wind turbine operates as though it's alone. And this is really how most wind farms operate. This is the upper left. In the upper right, we have each wind turbine using its own information, but trying to achieve farm-wide objectives. So, kind of operating on their own information, but with the knowledge that they're in a wind farm and that their actions will affect other wind turbines. We have this in the lower left, the other case where you have potentially individual objectives for each turbine, but they may share information via centralized control. And then at the bottom right, the whole enchilada of wind turbines operating to achieve farm-wide objectives while sharing information. So to just give a quick example of one of the success stories from wind farm control, is this concept of wake steering, where if you intentionally misalign an upstream turbine with the wind, you apply a lateral force on the wake of the wind turbine, and that pushes the wake away, potentially, if you do it right, from a downstream turbine, and allows higher inflow wind speeds at that downstream turbine, which allows higher power capture. And it turns out that if you do this right, you do give up a little bit of power at your upwind turbine doing this, but you capture more power at the downwind turbine, and so you produce more power overall between the two. Just an example on the sort of bottom left corner of what you might do if you are sharing information between turbines. Here's an animation showing the wind direction measured by a bunch of turbines in a wind farm, and you can see that they're really kind of all over the place. They're not agreeing with each other very well, and so their wind turbines are going to be pointing in different directions and not sort of necessarily doing the best they can do. But if you share information between the turbines and kind of use it cleverly to give them better information about what the wind direction is, you can get a much more kind of cohesive behavior from the wind turbines in the wind farm, and so that they sort of more smoothly move to face the wind and do more do a better job of kind of maintaining good operation. And so it's this kind of thing that kind of motivates the idea of, well, if we have many wind turbines operating in a wind farm, what could we do to use the information that they all collect to maybe do some smart curtailment or smart control operation to mitigate bat risks without necessarily needing to, ideally without needing to shut down the whole wind farm. So again, that's the sort of motivational question. What can we do for controlling wind turbines to mitigate bat collisions, while again trying to maintain decent power output and capture power and therefore revenue for the wind farm operator? So the reality is that we don't have an answer to that question. So we're going to start with just a kind of well, not actually that easy. Still don't really have an answer to this question either, but why are they attracted to wind turbines in the first place? We're going to need to be able to model bat behavior near wind turbines if we want to be able to control wind turbines to reduce bat takes. So there's been work that has sort of laid out roadmaps for testing hypotheses for why bats are attracted to turbines, and then assuming that they are attracted and not just randomly colliding with wind turbines, what the reasons for those attractions are. And we sort of use that as a motivation to generate this notion of can we develop a simulation model for bat movements and then compare that to real data to sort of try to figure out what's going on with bat flight paths near wind turbines, and eventually in the long run use that model for designing controllers to mitigate bat risks. So I won't get into too much of the sort of gory details of what the simulation model looks like, but the idea is that we use turbulent wind fields, simulated turbulent wind fields, and we use a bat model is sort of a bluff body that is affected by the turbulence in the wind, as well as potentially attractive forces that draw it towards certain targets, potentially the wind turbine. And we also kind of look at whether how simulated bats flying in this turbulent wind field are affected by the presence of wind turbine wakes. So areas of lower wind speed and potentially higher turbulence caused by the existence of wind turbines in the flow. And so just to give a quick example of what that might look like. So here, this red line is showing the X, Y, and Z trajectory of a single simulated bat dropped into this turbulent wind field. And the difference between the solid line and the dotted line is whether there's a wake that the bat enters as it moves downstream. So essentially this bat is moving passively downstream, which is why the X direction is kind of just close to a straight line. And then it's kind of being buffeted a bit side to side in the Y and Z directions. But you can see that it slows down as it enters the wake because of those lower speeds around second 16 or so. With the dotted line, that's the existence of the wake and the bat kind of entering the wake region and therefore moving downstream more slowly. And that's nice, but again, the idea was to kind of look at what they might be attracted to under the sort of hypothesis that bats are maybe attracted to wind turbines and sort of targets in and around wind farms. And so here we've built in an attraction model that says, well, if there's a static target that's at some location in the flow field, here it turns out I've chosen here for the point of simulation X, Y, Z of 100, 0, 100. Then how does that affect the bat flight dynamics? And that depends, of course, on the sort of strength of their attraction, how strongly they move towards the target. And so we have different trajectories here in blue, depending on how strong that attraction is. And maybe a little more interesting again is what if they're attracted to moving targets in particular? What if they're attracted to the blades of the wind turbines? So this simulation, now kind of just showing this in 3 dimensions, shows that the motion of a free stream bat, so not attracted to the wind turbine and just moving with the turbulence, that's in red, versus the motion of the same bat, but attracted to each of the 3 blade tips as they rotate around while the turbine is operating. So the disc there is the location of the turbine rotor. Haven't shown individual blades, but the blades are essentially there, and the bat is attracted to the tips. And you see that it sort of approaches kind of roughly following similar motion to the free flow motion. But once it sort of gets close to the rotor, it starts this sort of chaotic motion as it sort of jumps around attracted to each of the blade tips. And now we're sort of starting to get close to this types of trajectories that have been observed at actual wind farms or wind turbines of bats flying in and around wind turbine rotors. So this is a figure that that comes from a Michael Schiermacher report. But yeah, just showing motions of bats in and around a wind turbine rotor, and yeah, again, sort of seeing this chaotic motion that we're getting close to simulating with our model. So that we just wanted to kind of step back a bit and say, well, while we're here simulating individual turbine motions, the reality is that we're not expecting to be able to really model the motion of any one bat. What we really want to use this model for is to get statistical models of how bats may move in and around wind turbines, and also maybe look at the spectra of bat flight paths, and whether we can match those with spectra from observed bat flight paths, and therefore kind of justify what the bats might be attracted to based on the sort of spectral properties that we see in these flight paths. So here again, this is now the simulation with the turbine, with the bat attracted to the blade tips, and you see that there's this sort of peak spike at the 3p frequency. That's basically the frequency that a blade passes the tower, or a blade passes a fixed point in space. And so because the bat is attracted to those blade ends, we see sort of this extra energy in the bat flight path at that frequency. So we have a model. We need to kind of validate it. We need to collect more data and kind of compare the model to flight tracks that are actually observed. We're still in the process of doing that. We have some data from the Flatirons campus, and there's going to be more data collected in California that we're hoping to be able to use to compare this model to and make adjustments. So yeah, I don't have any final results that say that this model is perfect, and I'm sure that there's still tweaking needed, but it gives us the opportunity to model these bats and again, further down the line, hopefully be able to take sort of smart control actions to help mitigate bat ticks. Just want to call out that I didn't do this alone. Eliot in the top left, you may recognize, he was speaking just a minute ago. He was the one that kind of drove this work and yeah, this was the turbulence expert, but also involved was Jeff Clerk and Sora Ryu. So yeah, thanks to them as well. All right, I will leave it there.
Thanks, Misha. And if Julie and Eliot come on video, we've got about 9 minutes, give or take, for questions, and we've got several questions in the chat. So one question, Julie, I think this is for you. Did you have the opportunity to see if other bat species showed similar relationships between lower blade tip height and mortality rates?
So we did not. We had to, as part of our investigation, we intentionally looked at just one representative species because we wanted to look at sort of something that would have the broadest implications for the most territory covered. So that was hoary bats. It would take a lot more. I mean, it's not impossible. The model is public, and the underlying data is public. So others could certainly use that to look at other bat species, and they may find different relationships, or they may find that they're similar. But I would imagine the effective region would be important, especially as you're looking at species that don't have as national of a distribution.
Eliot, I think this one was for you, but Julie, you might have some thoughts on this too. So does the 50-meter turbine that reduces bat mortality by 60% also decrease raptor mortality the same amount? Or if not, what amount does it decrease bird mortality?
Yeah, I think that's a really challenging question. I think we can't really, I wouldn't confidently come up with a number that says, okay, this is the relationship between ground clearance and raptor mortality. We're talking about very different species, very different behaviors. Raptor flight behavior is strongly related to the flight environment. So if it's under orographic soaring conditions, its movement is dictated by the landscape. If it's in the daytime during thermaling conditions, then it could fly 1, 2, 3 kilometers above the ground. And really, the greatest risk to raptors is probably when, or one of the greatest risks is probably when they're foraging. And so that is closely related to the prey distribution, which we don't have great data on and could vary from year to year. Bats, on the other hand, very different flight behaviors. There's also the social element. So if they're flying around awake, it could be attractive because there's prey or insects, or it could be attractive because there's just a lot of other bats. So it's apples and oranges, but very interesting question though.
And Julie, you focus.
Yeah, I guess I was just going to add to that we looked, again, red-tailed hawk not being inclusive of all raptors, but being a good representative, we found that the rotor diameter was the strongest influencer on, and increases in rotor diameter size increase the red-tailed hawk mortality rate. So that's going to be a little bit different. So you could, basically meaning regardless of how high the tower was above the ground, it was the rotor diameter that was influencing the raptor mortality. So we're seeing it's different aspects of the turbine that are influencing the mortality of these different taxa.
Let's see. So how transferable are these findings regarding ground clearance to offshore wind installations, given their taller hub heights, or is the distribution of bats offshore not as great of a concern?
I guess speaking for the biology, I think they are finding that bats do migrate offshore. I don't know that, I think the prevailing thought is that as far like 3 miles offshore, where most of the offshore wind development is being thought of, is that there's less bat migration. But I think that, there are still bats out there from the surveys that are being done. I don't know that the ground clearance effects that we find on onshore wind farms, though, would necessarily transfer. I think because you've got, I mean, bats are, I mean, I'm not a bat biologist, but I just can't imagine that there's as much insect activity out 3 miles away from land than there is over vegetation onshore. So I think it would be dangerous to assume that it's the same relationship.
This one says for all, so maybe Misha, if you have thoughts first, and then the others can chime in. Could it be that they're attracted to wind turbines because they're saving energy by using the produced wind flow to glide up instead of using their energy on flapping, similar to how the free-tailed bats coming out of Bracken Cave create a bat NATO to catch the wind instead of flying straight up? Is there a possibility to use sonar or something else to make the turbines and the area around them less attractive to bats?
Yeah, so yeah, again, like I'm really not a bat biologist, and so I may say things that are really just incorrect, and Chris can just come in and just cut me down. But my understanding is that the reality is we don't know. Yes, that could be a possibility, that these sort of wake areas behind wind turbines are these low speed zones, and if the bats are trying to move in an upstream kind of direction, if they're trying to migrate upstream, that low speed zone may be sort of attractive in terms of requiring less energy to move upwind. The wakes also are characterized by higher turbulence intensity, so bats may be attracted to the wake because to the wake rather than to the wind turbine for the low speed reasons that we just talked about, but also potentially because there's higher turbulence intensity. So again, that's sort of maybe not the full explanation. Maybe that means there's more insects. Maybe that means that they just have more fun. There's more social possibilities for bats in more turbulent air. So again, I think there's lots of hypotheses, but we don't really know why bats are flying in around turbines and around wakes. But in terms of the second part of your question, yeah, I believe that there are studies looking at kind of deterrent technologies for bats around wind turbines and wind farms. So looking at, whether there's kind of two on both sides, whether there's audio coming from wind turbines that bats are actually attracted to, whether there's, frequency content in the sound of wind turbines that bats are attracted to, and then whether we can create, synthetically create frequencies that bats don't like in order to discourage bats from being up and near wind turbines.
I can add some comments. So I think some of the work that Misha's doing in wind turbine control, if bats are attracted to wakes, then one of the leading areas of research and controls right now is to can you actually control the wake and steer it and redirect it in different ways. So there could be a synergistic effect between these two areas of research. But it's a great question of, where exactly are the bats flying within a wind farm, and are they attracted? And I think at this point in time, we're only just beginning to have the technology available to actually track individual movements effectively. And we actually have a field study that just concluded a few months ago where we tracked specifically hoary bats, not in a wind farm, but just to understand the movements of hoary bats specifically. So I think we can leverage a lot of existing data sets to learn more about their behaviors.
Okay, well, we're at time. We're at the top of the hour. So I want to thank Misha, Eliot, and Julie so much for their time today and in preparing their presentations. Thanks, everybody, for joining today's webinar. And yeah, hope everybody has a good day.
Thanks all.
Thanks.